sure you can see my screen. Okay. Okay, who missed that link? Go ahead and answer if you didn't do so already. I'll give you another second. Okay, cool. Yes. So when we were talking about these two ions, right? So they're ions, so they have charges on them, which means we have an electrical driving force in addition to a chemical driving force. So their overall direction they want to move is going to be described by our total summative electrochemical driving force. And we can tell which direction that points shorthand just by looking at an equilibrium potential. When we look at that equilibrium potential, that number telling you what that ion wants our membrane potential to be. So our membrane potential is a measurement of the current state of our cell, right? So the current difference between charge inside and outside the cell. Okay, so sodium is going to stop moving. It's going to be at equilibrium when our membrane potential gets to positive 60. So for sodium, that electrochemical driving force, get us to positive 60. There's going to be lots and lots of sodium ions moving into our cell, raising that membrane potential up and up and up, crossing zero, going up and up and up further, only stopping if we happen to get to positive 60. For potassium, we have the opposite situation. So potassium is going to have equal and opposing chemical and electrical driving forces only if we get all the way to negative 94. Okay? So potassium is going to move in the direction that gets us closer to negative 94. Since it's a positive ion, the only way it can make the cell more negative is by moving out of the cell. Right? So potassium wants to leave the cell to get itself closer to that equilibrium state at negative 94. So this is our baseline setup for understanding what's going on with a neuron. For a neuron, at rest, when they're not firing off, they're not talking to each other, they're not sending off neurotransmitters, the membrane potential of a neuron is going to sit at about negative 70 millivolts. So that's their baseline state. That's the baseline difference between how many positive and negative charges there are inside the cell versus outside the cell. Okay. So comparing that to our equilibrium potentials for sodium up top and potassium down on bottom, right, we're going to have this kind of competition. So both sodium and potassium are going to be important for the function of the neuron. They're going to want to flow in different directions, right? Sodium is going to want to flow in, and if it does, we'd see this membrane potential rise up closer to that sodium equilibrium potential. Potassium wants to escape. If potassium escapes, we're going to sink down, down, down towards that super negative potassium equilibrium potential. We're going to notice, if we're looking at this, that our baseline state is way closer to that potassium equilibrium potential than it is to the sodium equilibrium potential. The reason for this is potassium is better able to cross the membrane of a neuron due to how many channels there are for potassium in that membrane of the neuron. Okay? So potassium is able to leave the cell more often. It kind of leaks out at baseline, which is what keeps us at that negative 70 millivolts, right? So we're kind of down at the bottom in part because we have this greater permeability to potassium. Because we're down near that potassium equilibrium potential, means that we have a relatively weaker force for potassium to flow out, and we have a really strong force for sodium to flow in if we happen to open up sodium channels. So we can't release that big force on sodium unless we have a door in the membrane, right? Like unless we have a way for it to get through, unless that membrane somehow becomes more permeable to sodium. So when we're setting up the membrane potential, if we imagine that we started with our whole cell, we're going to see that this overall membrane potential was actually set up by our classic example of primary active transport, the sodium potassium pump. So using ATP to move both sodium and potassium against their gradients, against the direction that they want to go. So in that unfavorable direction. And we're going to see that at baseline, red is sodium. Okay. Right. So sodium was moving out. Here we see those sodium ions moving out. Potassium was moving in. The blue ones are potassium. Okay. And here we can see noted on that high permeability for potassium. So potassium is being allowed to escape much faster than sodium is being allowed back into the cell. We want to understand this kind of ionic basis of our resting membrane potential. So what we're going to see are shifts from this baseline. So we're starting with a generic cell, and we're going to say we're going to start at 0, right? We're going to start in a situation where there was no difference between the inside and the outside of the cell, right? So start with a VM 0. Okay. On this imaginary cell, we're going to add that sodium potassium pump, that primary active transport using ATP. Okay. And that primary active transport using ATP and the sodium potassium pump pumps out free sodium. Okay. And it allows in to potassium. For yourself, you jot this down and jot down for yourself what you think this is going to do to that membrane potential. So is this membrane potential changing? What direction is it changing every time we run that sodium potassium pump? I'm going to start with a show of hands. Who thinks there's a change here? Some hands. Good. It is a change. This does have an effect on the membrane potential. Right. Who thinks that this raises the membrane potential? Who thinks that this lowers the membrane potential? Okay. Yeah. So we moved 3 positive charges out. We only brought back in 2 positive charges. Let's say we started with 3 negative charges on each side to begin with, right? So in this case, we're balancing out those negative charges on the outside of the cell, but now we have extra negative inside the cell. So we'd be lowering that membrane potential as we have the sodium potassium pump running. Okay. Cool. Right. When we're thinking about this resting membrane potential, this is established because we have an equilibrium potential for potassium ions and for sodium ions. Right? So for our sodium ions, it's positive 60. For potassium ions, it's negative 94. And part of the reason that we have these equilibrium potentials in the first place, that an equilibrium potential, right, is reflecting when we have electrical driving forces and chemical driving forces equal and in opposition, right? And that sodium potassium pump we were just running, it's changing the membrane potential of the cell. But as it does that, it's changing the chemical gradient of sodium and potassium, right? We're creating like a vacuum, emptying the cell of sodium, and we're pulling in potassium, right? Concentrating it in the cell. So that's why there's a chemical driving force that we can predict on sodium and potassium in the first place. So that's where our chemical driving force comes from. And as we were moving that pump, moving the sodium and potassium, but not in equal numbers, we were creating that charge, that surplus negative charge inside the cell, which is where we get an electrical driving force on both of these ions from, right? And that's what creates our resting membrane potential for a cell. For a neuron, happens to be at about -70. Other cell types, other cell tissues, are able to have like a varying resting membrane potential. So you'd be specific about what specific type of cell you're talking about. You're giving a resting membrane potential. They're pretty much always negative though. So like -5 millivolts to -100 millivolts are normal numbers you might observe. Neurons sit at -70 because we know how they operate. And we have measured, have checked how fast that sodium potassium pump is running, how often, what that's doing to concentration and electrical forces. So when we were setting up our resting membrane potential, we set up a concentration gradient of our ions using the sodium potassium pump. Know that this also set up a little bit of membrane polarity on that resting membrane potential, right? We saw it dropping down. The other thing that's going to be important here when we think about where the resting membrane potential sits is that permeability of the membrane side, right? So you can imagine the situation in which we pump lots of sodium out, but we have about a gajillion open sodium channels, right? Then it would tend to just kind of erase itself, right? Because the sodium ions would go out, but then they just come back in through some open channels. Wouldn't have a long-term effect here. But because the membrane is not so permeable to sodium, this means that sodium ions aren't able to come back in. That has an important effect here on that resting membrane potential of the neuron itself. Okay. This is just a table from your book, helping you define again some of these terms if you're still confused, right? So membrane potentials are the difference in voltage across the plasma membrane, right? So it's describing the current state, basically. When we say a membrane potential, like I'm just reporting a number and saying this is what the cell is currently at. We can have differences. We're not going to use the potential difference that much in this way, but we are going to talk about at rest, right? So when we say a cell is at rest, we mean it's not doing anything. When we say a neuron isn't doing anything, we're talking about a neuron that's not firing yet. Okay? And that's important because we're going to see that neurons receive signals and they send out signals. And anytime they receive or send out a signal, we're going to see a change of that membrane potential. So that -70 number is going to go up, it's going to come back down in response to the signal coming in or in order to send signals out of the cell. So we'll talk about our graded potentials, which are basically going to be responses to signals coming in. And our action potential is going to be the main way we send signals out. And we know that we have an equilibrium potential that has an influence, tells us really which direction that ion wants to go overall, right? So by definition, at equilibrium, there's no movement. There's no movement because we have equal and opposing forces on that ion. So you'll probably want to come back to that after we talk about graded potentials and action potentials and make sure that you can get all those different but similar terms kind of straight in your heads. Okay. Resting membrane potential for a neuron is -70 millivolts. And there are reasons for that. So 20% of that resting membrane potential, so 20% of the reason for why we're at -70 is directly because we pumped out on net one positive charge, right? So one extra sodium ion versus potassium ions that we were bringing back in. So we refer to the sodium potassium pump as electrogenic. So that electrogenic effect, that directly, now we have extra negative inside the cell because we removed some of the positive. That's about 20% of the reason for our sodium, or the reason for our resting membrane potential. The rest of the resting membrane potential is still related to this action of the sodium potassium pump, but a little more indirectly. The sodium potassium pump is changing our concentration gradients for sodium and potassium. So it's creating this situation, or if we're thinking about our cell, we were looking at our gradients, like if we were trying to determine our CDF, right, our chemical driving force. So not the sum total, not the electrochemical driving force, but just the chemical driving force, right? We have high sodium outside the cell. Okay. And we have low sodium inside the cell because of the way we've been pumping that sodium out. Okay. Which means we have a chemical driving force of sodium into the cell. That same action of the sodium potassium pump was creating really high potassium inside, right? Because we're trading sodium and potassium. Okay. High potassium to low potassium outside. Which is part of why we have that potassium wanting to leave the cell. We wanted to add on our electrical driving forces, just touching base because I want to make sure that we really fully understand this, right? So we know that we've just made the cell kind of negative inside, right? So if our CDFs are this, that happens to also be the direction of our electrochemical driving force, okay? But if you wanted to pull out all the pieces, right, as we did in the first unit, you'd also need the electrical driving force, right, which for both sodium and potassium would be in, because they're both cations, they're both positive ions.
Oh shit, I gotta post it.
Look at all my stuff up. Oh, and I didn't feel so I walked up to the grab, and then I'm like struggling, and I'm just trying to all keep waiting.
Turn off my audio. Okay, that looks like whoever's audio is on realize, so that's great. Okay. All right. So for sodium, this means we have that really strong electrochemical driving force for sodium to move into the cell, because both the chemical driving force and the electrical driving force are pointing in. Versus for potassium, we got a slightly weaker situation because our chemical driving force is pointing out. We do have an electrical driving force pointing in, right? So in total, our electrochemical driving force is pointing out, but it's not as strong as that desire of sodium to come back into the cell. Okay. So in our typical neuron, we've got resting membrane potential of -70. We know that it's way more permeable to potassium than to sodium. The potassium is more able to move across that membrane. There are more potassium channels. In fact, there are 25 times more potassium channels than there are sodium channels in your average neuron. That's part of why we're so close to the equilibrium potential for potassium. For all our ion distribution, but on net, we have lots of extra sodium outside the cell. We also happen to have some extra chloride ions for our neuron outside the cell. Inside the cell, we've got a fair amount of potassium, so that's our positive charge inside the cell, but our resting membrane potential is -70, so it's overall negative, because there happens to be lots of organic anions, so organic ions with a negative charge inside the cell, and not enough potassium to cancel that out. All right, so let's do another question. So if we're starting out with our cell, we're starting out with our resting membrane potential, what would happen if I increase the permeability of that membrane to potassium? What kind of change would you see? both in terms of what direction you see the ion moving and what's happening to that membrane potential, right? Going from -70 to -65, they're going from -70 to -75. Another couple seconds. Okay. So it seems like we all understand that our potassium is going to leave the cell. Oh, wait, never mind. We don't all understand that. Okay. Let's talk about it one more time. Okay. So remember what we set up in our cell, resting membrane potential, -70. Okay. Equilibrium potential. Oh, because answers are changing. I shouldn't have circled that. Okay. Cool. All right. So equilibrium potential for potassium. Okay. It's -94. Okay. So potassium wants the inside of the cell to get to -94. So in order to do that, we'd have to move positive ions out of the cell, right? So potassium wants to leave the cell, okay? And we happen to know that that is in the direction of the chemical driving force. If we think about our sodium potassium complex, we know we've really concentrated potassium inside the cell, low amounts of potassium outside the cell. So that is what's taking over and giving us that slight electrochemical driving force out of the cell. So every time a potassium ion leaves, we get a little more negative, right? So go down to -71, -72, etc., until we hit -94, at which point that chemical driving force would basically be erased. It would be equal to how strongly our electrical driving force is pulling potassium into the cell. Movement of the ion would stop. Okay, so every time a positive ion leaves the cell, which is what potassium wants to do, that membrane potential goes down, becomes more and more negative. So questions about this setup, because I think we're still, at least some of us, a little shaky on this idea of forces on ions and overall.
I didn't wrapping my head around the whole potassium on the positive charge and then wants the negative.
Yeah, okay, cool. All right. So potentially one of the confusions we might have, right, is that potassium is a positively charged ion, right? We know that the charge on the inside of the cell is negative, right? So we do know that there is at least some force for opposite charges to draw together, right? So we have some attraction of potassium towards that negative charge. The piece that's missing here, that part is true, but that's only one part of the picture. So specifically, that's our electrical driving force, right? So potassium has to like decide whether it's going to follow that electrical driving force or whether it's following our chemical driving force, which is going super strongly in the opposite direction, right? So the chemical driving force, there's a really big separation between how high concentration of potassium we have inside the cell and how low that concentration of potassium is outside the cell. So it's not that there's no force for potassium to go into the cell. It's that this concentration difference is so big and so strong that that's pulling potassium outside of the cell really, really, really strongly, even though this electrical driving force has a tendency to move potassium in. Okay. And so the equilibrium potential giving us that electrochemical driving force has baked into it some knowledge of this chemical gradient, right? So if we didn't have that equilibrium potential, if we didn't have that chemical gradient, potassium would want to go into the cell. But we know that we've set up this chemical gradient with our sodium potassium pump, and we know it's really big, and that's what that legend is. Does that make a little more sense? Other questions about this setup? Talk about it more if you're afraid to ask in front of the class, but this is really important to know which direction these ions want to move, because otherwise when we're talking about this voltage gated channel opens and changes the permeability of sodium or whatever potassium, you're not going to be able to relate that to this behavior of the nerve. So don't be afraid to ask me more questions about this, even if we talked about it already. Okay. So potassium trying to get to its equilibrium potential, -94. The equilibrium potential is -94, not because of the electrical driving force, but because we've set up this really strong chemical driving force that is stronger than the electrical driving force into the cell, right? So it's that chemical driving force, right, and that packing in of the potassium ions into the cell is creating this chemical force for potassium to go out. That chemical driving force lets potassium go out of the cell through an ion channel. So you do have to have an ion channel in order for potassium to leave the cell. It can't go directly through the membrane. It's not lipid soluble, but we do have ion channels for potassium. We have leak channels. So as that potassium leaves the cell down that chemical gradient, right? The inside of the cell is becoming a little bit more negative, right? Which is when we start to see that electrical driving force starting to give us a little bit of a pull into the cell on that potassium ion. But we still have a really big chemical driving force, right? So there's a little bit of a kind of tug of war here. But so far, our chemical driving force is still winning out, just weakened a little bit by that electrical force. Okay. Cool. So if we got all the way to -94, right, that's a very negative number, right? So that negative number, that very negative number, that -94, be increasing our electrical driving force so much that at that point, we wouldn't have enough of a chemical driving force to keep pulling potassium out of the cell. So if we were to get to -94, right, that electrical driving force is so strong now that these two cancel each other out, which is why this is the equilibrium potential for potassium. Because that's the point at which we don't have any net force. We don't have an electrochemical driving force because these two are the same magnitude and in opposite directions. And so that's what it means when we say we have an equilibrium potential. It's telling us when we've gotten to this situation that both forces are just as big as each other, but we've got an even tug of war between the two, so there's no movement of the ion. Okay. That is how an equilibrium potential kind of gets established, right? So it's at equilibrium when there's no net movement on that, no net force on that ion, so no net movement of that ion. Right? So our chemical force is going to be equal in magnitude, but opposite in direction to that electrical force. And that's the point at which our electrochemical driving force would be zero because they're canceling each other. So we can do the same kind of hypothetical for sodium, right? So sodium does feel a little easier because both initially the chemical driving force and the electrical driving force for sodium point into the cell, right? But let's walk through it anyway. Right, so we're going to have a hypothetical cell that's permeable only to sodium. And we've got some positive and negative ions of various types, both inside and outside the cell. Okay. So we're thinking now just about our sodium, right? So we've pumped a bunch of sodium out of the cell, right? We're starting at a membrane potential of 0. So we have a chemical driving force down that gradient into the cell. So sodium wants to diffuse into the cell. The tricky thing is, right, if we started at 0 and we let sodium come into the cell, we moved positive charges into the cell. We've now made the inside of the cell positive, right? So as we have the inside of the cell become positive, which we will see in the typical behavior of a neuron during the action potential, and if the inside of the cell becomes positive, now we are again actually creating an electrical driving force where that positive charge and the positive charge on the sodium are kind of bouncing off each other. So our electrical driving force on sodium, as the cell becomes more and more positive, goes the opposite way, right? So has a tendency to push sodium out of the cell. This would happen until you get to positive 60. And that would be the point at which that repelling of sodium out of the cell, right, that pushback against pulling sodium in would be strong enough to combat our very strong chemical driving force for sodium into the cell. So there is a point at which we would have a conflict between our sodium chemical driving force and electrical driving force, but we wouldn't get there until we're up at positive 60. Okay. So we will see the neurons having positive membrane potentials at certain phases in their signaling process. But we're going to see that they can only get so positive because at a certain point, you'd hit the sodium equilibrium potential. So at a certain point, their mechanisms for becoming more positive are not even going to work. Okay. So in that situation where we had a positive membrane potential, which we'll see during certain parts of our action potential, we'd have a chemical driving force on sodium to move in, but we'd have an electrical driving force on sodium to move out. Okay. As we get to our equilibrium potential, that's when we have our forces completely canceling each other out, getting us an electrochemical driving force of 0, as that electrical force increases in strength to combat the chemical driving force. Cool. So if we put that overall picture together, we had our chemical driving force for potassium out of the cell, our chemical driving force for sodium into the cell. We started at 0, right? Our membrane lets potassium move more because we've got more channels, right? Potassium is the one that wants to lead down that chemical driving force initially. So that first picture was starting us at 0, right? So no charge on the inside of the cell. So more potassium leaves than sodium enters, right? So we're not replacing all those positive charges leaving the cell. So the inside of the cell is becoming negative. Okay. And this continues, right? Our electrical forces develop. So on the potassium side, that electrical force is opposite to the chemical driving force coming in, but both sodium and potassium are cations. Both of them are positive ions. So that force for sodium is coming in too. We just don't usually think about it as a problem because that chemical driving force was already pointing in. That cell is becoming negative because of this effect of the potassium leaving the cell and all those open potassium channels. So as we move down and get more and more negative, the potassium starts to flow out a little slower because we're getting closer to its equilibrium potential. And our sodium flow in starts to get stronger and stronger and stronger because we have that chemical force and we're making that electrical force stronger and stronger and stronger, also pulling sodium into the cell. So that's where we're gonna set ourselves up to get to the resting membrane potential, right? So this is linked in your announcements. You can do it now by a QR code, or you can click on the link in your announcements. You're doing this daily survey. You're gonna tell me what part of this made the most sense to you, what part of this you feel a little shaky on. Come up with an idea to yourself about how you can clarify some of that confusion. If you're not confused, still you're just writing down a topic of like, which part of today's lecture is most important for you to review for the exam.